My mother's fingers dug into my shoulders hard enough to bruise. Her voice pitched low and urgent in the police station parking lot. Just tell them you were driving. Please. Nadia. Just this once. Do this for your sister. I looked past her toward my sister Camille, sitting composed in the back of my father's car, checking her makeup in a compact mirror like she hadn't just struck a pedestrian with her vehicle 20 minutes earlier. She has a campaign, my father added, his voice carrying the particular urgency he reserved for anything involving Camille's political future. City council announcement is in 3 weeks. You have nothing to lose here, Nadia. You don't even have a real job people would recognize. I felt something in my chest go very still, the particular stillness that comes right before you decide exactly how much longer you're willing to let people underestimate you. Camille rolled down her window, catching the tail end of our conversation, and smirked in a way I'd watched my entire life, the expression of someone who'd never once faced consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. Who would even believe you anyway? She said, not quite loud enough for the approaching officer to hear. What none of them knew, standing in that parking lot demanding I sacrifice myself for a sister who'd spent 30 years treating me as the family's disappointing afterthought, was that I wasn't the unemployed, directionless daughter they'd always assumed. I was Judge Nadia Osei, appointed to the federal bench 18 months earlier, a fact I deliberately kept from my family for reasons that were about to become devastatingly clear. I'd kept my career secret from my family for almost 6 years, ever since I'd first been appointed to a state judgeship before eventually being nominated for my current federal position. It wasn't shame that kept me silent. It was self-preservation, a lesson learned slowly and painfully throughout a childhood spent watching my family's entire emotional architecture organize itself around Camille's ambitions. Camille had always been the golden child, the daughter our parents invested in completely, funding her law degree, her early campaign contributions, every social connection that might eventually elevate her political career. I'd been the quiet, unremarkable sister, the one who never quite found her footing, according to my mother's frequent, casual dismissals at family gatherings. What my parents never knew was that I'd graduated at the top of my law school class, clerked for a federal appellate judge, and built a career entirely without their support or knowledge, deliberately avoiding any professional overlap that might draw their attention. I'd changed my professional last name slightly, using my grandmother's maiden name, Osei, rather than our family name, Whitfield, a small legal formality that had inadvertently provided years of protective distance from a family that had never once bothered to look closely enough to notice. I'd told myself for years that keeping my career private was simply about avoiding unnecessary complications with Camille's political ambitions, about not wanting my achievements to become another battleground in a sibling rivalry I'd never actually chosen to participate in. But standing in that parking lot, watching my parents demand I take responsibility for an accident I hadn't caused, protecting a sister who'd struck a pedestrian while apparently texting, I understood that my silence had never actually protected anyone. It had simply allowed my family to continue believing whatever version of me was most convenient for them. That was about to change, starting with the specific words the responding officer used when she finally approached our small, tense gathering. "Ma'am," the officer said, approaching with careful professionalism. Witnesses at the scene identified the driver as a woman matching your description, dark hair, approximately 30 years old, driving a silver sedan. "Can you confirm you were behind the wheel?" I felt my mother's grip tighten further on my shoulder, a silent, desperate command. "I wasn't driving," I said clearly, watching Camille's composed expression flicker for just a moment. "My sister was." The officer's eyes moved between us, noting our obvious resemblance, the tension radiating from my parents. "We'll need statements from everyone at the scene. The victim, a Mr. Aldrich Simmons, has been transported to Memorial Hospital with what appears to be a fractured leg and possible internal injuries. Given the severity, this will likely result in formal charges, depending on further investigation." Camille's careful composure cracked slightly at the mention of formal charges. "This is ridiculous," she said, stepping forward. "I've told you, I wasn't even driving. My sister was behind the wheel." The officer looked at her, then back at me, clearly sensing the family tension but professionally unwilling to simply accept either version without further investigation. "We have a witness who took photographs at the scene, actually, before either of you exited the vehicle. Those images should clarify things considerably once we review them. I watched Camille's face pale slightly at that information, understanding, along with me, that whatever story she'd been constructing was about to collide directly with photographic evidence neither of us had known existed. My father's expression shifted from urgent to genuinely alarmed. Photographs, he repeated quietly, as if testing whether that word might somehow be less threatening if spoken aloud. I said nothing, watching my family's carefully maintained narrative begin, for the first time in my life, to show real cracks. The witness, an elderly man named Harold Vance who'd been walking his dog nearby, had captured 3 photographs on his phone in the moments immediately following the collision. Images that clearly showed Camille in the driver's seat, her phone visible in her hand, before she'd apparently climbed into the passenger seat during the chaotic minutes before police arrived. Those photographs, combined with traffic camera footage the department later retrieved from a nearby intersection, established an unambiguous timeline that made my family's desperate improvisation entirely unnecessary and unmistakably fraudulent. Mrs. Whitfield, the officer said, addressing Camille directly now, her tone considerably less patient than before. We're going to need you to come down to the station for a formal statement. Given the evidence we're gathering, I'd strongly recommend having legal representation present. Camille's earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by something closer to panic as she realized the photographic evidence eliminated any possibility of successfully transferring blame onto me. I want to speak with my father's attorney, she said, her voice tight. My mother turned to me then, something desperate and pleading in her expression that I recognized immediately, the same look she'd given me throughout childhood whenever she needed me to absorb some inconvenience on Camille's behalf. Nadia, please, she said quietly. You have connections in the legal world, don't you? Through whatever work you actually do. Can't you help fix this? I looked at my mother for a long moment, understanding that even now, faced with undeniable evidence of Camille's actual guilt, her instinct remained protecting her golden child rather than acknowledging what had actually happened. I do have connections, I said finally. But not the kind you're imagining. I reached into my bag and retrieved my identification, the one I rarely showed my family, the one that would finally, unavoidably, reveal exactly who I'd become during the years they dismissed me as their family's quiet disappointment. My father took the identification card from my hand, studying it with obvious confusion before his expression shifted into something closer to disbelief. Federal judge, he read aloud slowly, as if the words themselves required translation. Nadia, what is this? That's my actual profession, I said calmly. Has been for over a year now, though I clerked and served on the state bench for years before that. I've kept it private deliberately, because I learned a long time ago that this family only values achievements that somehow reflect back onto Camille's ambitions. My mother stared at the identification, then at me, something between shock and shame crossing her face. You're a judge, she repeated. A federal judge. And you never told us. Why would I? I asked, not unkindly, just honestly. Every conversation in this family eventually circles back to Camille's career, Camille's campaign, Camille's future. There was never room for anything about my life that might complicate that narrative. Camille, still visibly shaken from the officer's earlier warning, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from her before, something like genuine fear beneath her usual composure. This doesn't change anything, she said, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. You still can't do anything to help me here. You're right, I said. I can't, and more importantly, I wouldn't, even if I could. Judicial ethics prevent me from intervening in your case regardless of our relationship. And honestly, even without those restrictions, I wouldn't help you lie your way out of hitting someone with your car while you were texting. The officer, who'd been quietly observing this entire family revelation unfold, finally spoke again. Given the circumstances, and given that Judge Osei has clarified her position clearly, I think we have everything we need to proceed with Ms. Whitfield's statement. Camille was formally taken into custody 20 minutes later, charged with leaving the scene of an accident, providing false information to police, and reckless driving resulting in injury. The following months unfolded with the particular slowness of legal proceedings, Camille's case moving through the court system while her political campaign, unsurprisingly, collapsed entirely once local news outlets picked up the story of a city council candidate charged with attempting to frame her sister for a hit and run. I testified during her sentencing hearing, not as her sister seeking leniency, but as a character witness for the prosecution, describing honestly the pattern of behavior I'd witnessed throughout our lives. Camille's consistent belief that consequences existed for other people, never for her. Camille received 18 months probation, community service, and a suspended license, a relatively lenient sentence that nonetheless effectively ended her political ambitions and required her to genuinely reckon, for the first time in her life, with actions she couldn't simply talk a way out of. My relationship with my parents shifted slowly, unevenly, in the months that followed. My mother, initially defensive about her attempt to pressure me into false testimony, eventually offered something resembling a genuine apology, admitting that she'd spent decades prioritizing Camille's ambitions without ever really examining why she'd found it so easy to ask me to sacrifice myself for her sister's benefit. My father struggled more with the revelation of my career, oscillating between genuine pride and uncomfortable guilt about years of dismissive comments he could no longer pretend hadn't happened. Camille and I haven't fully reconciled. Some betrayals require more time than others to process, and her willingness to let me potentially face criminal charges for her actions, simply because she assumed nobody would ever believe me over her, represents a wound that honest apology alone hasn't yet fully healed. I think about that parking lot moment often, my mother's desperate grip on my shoulders, my father's dismissive certainty that I had nothing to lose, Camille's confident smirk as she asked who would even believe me anyway. They were all about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption was. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that day. If your family spent years underestimating you, would you have revealed the truth the moment it mattered most? Or would you have continued protecting your privacy, even at your own expense?